April 2019. In the article I wrote for the April 2019 issue of this newsletter, I reminded you again. God made 2 covenants with the sons of Israel at Mount Sinai. The first covenant required the perfect obedience of the corporate body and did not provide a means of atonement. If one individual sinned, every member of the corporate body became guilty. The second covenant provided a means of atonement for the individual. If an individual sinned, his sin could be atoned for through a sacrificial ritual, but the corporate body still remained guilty. I have also explained these things in The Inheritance of the Believer, Volume 1. Then I showed you some of the things that I explain in The Inheritance of the Believer, Volume 1. I told you, the purpose of the Mosaic Covenant was to unify title to the promise that Jacob distributed to his sons. It was to make corporate Israel the heir of the promise, and to establish the terms under which God would fulfill the promise. The Inheritance of the Believer, Session 3. Then I reminded you that the inheritance of what was promised is conditioned on the collective obedience, the inheritance of what was promised. Corporate Israel already has the promise, under the Mosaic Covenant. That's the purpose. Bring this promise back and unify it, and make corporate Israel the heir of the promise. So corporate Israel, under the terms of the Mosaic Covenant, became the heir of the promise. In the same way that Abraham was heir of the promise. In the sense that Isaac was heir of the promise. In the sense that Jacob was heir of the promise. Now you have a group of people that God looks at parabolically as one person. Israel is my firstborn son. Exodus chapter 4, verse 22b. God said that, at the time of the Exodus. Then I showed you how God made Moses the heir of the promise by cutting off everyone else when the people sinned at Mount Sinai, and how he then made a second covenant with Moses. A covenant in which the people were viewed as members of Moses. A covenant that allowed Moses to hand the promise down to the people once again by making them corporate Israel and blessing them shortly before he died. I also told you to compare the blessing of Moses, who was the heir of the promise in his day, and the blessing of Jacob, who was the heir of the promise in his day. My point in showing you both the blessing of Moses and the blessing of Jacob was to make the point that both served the same function. In both cases, the heir of the promise was handing down the promise to the next heirs of the promise. I told you the difference is, Jacob divided up the promise and handed down various parts of the promise to his sons. Moses handed down the promise to the tribes of corporate Israel, the heir of the promise. But he did so only after the people ratified yet a third covenant, one in which they became members of the corporate entity rather than members of Moses.